She had the face of a screen goddess and the spirit of a revolutionary. Jean Seberg was Hollywood's golden girl until she wasn't. Praised in Paris, hunted in America, and ultimately erased from the industry she helped redefine. But what made every major studio turn its back on her? This is the heartbreaking story of Jean Seberg, the actress who became too dangerous for Hollywood to keep. Early life and career. Jean Dorothy Seberg was born on November 13th, 1938, in Marshalltown, Iowa, a small, quiet town where fame felt like a distant fantasy. The daughter of a pharmacist and a substitute teacher, she grew up in a conservative Midwestern household, excelling in school and showing early signs of a dramatic flair. As a teenager, Jean was deeply inspired by literature and cinema, idolizing stars like Ingrid Bergman and Joan of Arc, a role that would define her early career in ways she never expected. She was only 17 when her life changed overnight. Otto Preminger, the controversial Austrian-American director, launched a national talent search for an unknown actress to play the lead role of Joan of Arc in his film Saint Joan. Out of 18,000 hopefuls, Joan, a complete unknown, was chosen. Overnight, she was thrust into the global spotlight, promoted as a kind of cinematic savior. But that dream quickly began to unravel. The film flopped. Critics savaged her performance, calling her flat and amateurish. The pressure and scrutiny placed on a teenager with no formal acting training were cruel and overwhelming. The public failure of Saint Joan was deeply humiliating, but Preminger didn't give up on her. He cast her again in Bonjour Tristesse, a stylish French adaptation of François Sagan's novel. Though the film was more visually acclaimed, Seberg's performance once again drew criticism. Whispers in Hollywood grew louder. Maybe she just wasn't talented enough. But what Hollywood dismissed as a failure, France would soon celebrate as a revolution. It was in Paris, not Los Angeles, that Jean Seberg finally came into her own. In 1960, French New Wave director Jean-Luc Godard cast her in Breathless, a low-budget film that became a cinematic lightning bolt. Playing the mysterious and alluring Patricia Franchini, Jean wore her American identity like armor and vulnerability all at once. Her pixie cut, her existential cool, her fearless screen presence. They weren't just fashionable, they were the future. The French embraced her not only as an actress, but as a symbol of modern womanhood. In just a few short years, Jean Seberg had gone from an Iowa schoolgirl to the queen of French cinema. Hollywood noticed, but not in the way you might expect. As she straddled two worlds, France's radical art scene and America's conservative film industry, Jean became a curious case. She wasn't interested in studio system contracts, press junkets, or playing submissive roles. She wanted freedom, and that, in mid-century America, came at a price. While her fame blossomed overseas, her name became increasingly difficult to cast back in the States. Studios labeled her as difficult, unstable, and eventually unhirable. The reasons were rarely stated openly, but they were well understood. Jean Seberg didn't play by Hollywood's rules, and soon her off-screen life would give the studios the ultimate excuse to exile her. Rise to fame in film. Jean Seberg's rise to cinematic prominence came not through Hollywood's golden gates, but through the cigarette smoke and streetlight shadows of the French New Wave. In Breathless, directed by Jean-Luc Godard, Seberg wasn't just acting, she was redefined. The film shattered traditional storytelling. It was jump cuts and whispered rebellions, and there she was in the center of it all, cool, detached, vulnerable, mysterious. Her portrayal of Patricia, the American student seduced by a petty criminal on the run, became an archetype. Every movement she made in Breathless, that glance, that smile, that moment selling newspapers on the Champs-Élysées, cemented her as the face of a generation's cinematic revolution. Hollywood may have rejected her twice, but Europe was in awe. Suddenly, Jean was an international star, an American expat adored more abroad than at home. Hollywood took notice, cautiously. She began to receive offers again, not because they had faith in her range, but because she had become bankable in the European market. But Jean wasn't interested in playing glamorous secretaries or forgettable girlfriends. She wanted truth in art, and it showed in her role choices. In Lilith, she played a mentally unstable woman in a sanitarium, opposite Warren Beatty. The role was dark, introspective, and painfully vulnerable. Critics called it her best American performance. But even then, her refusal to be typecast rattled the powers behind the scenes. Then came the politics. Jean Seberg didn't just sympathize with the civil rights movement, she actively participated. She donated to the NAACP and more boldly, to the Black Panther Party, a revolutionary group that terrified much of white America. Jean didn't hide her support. She marched. She protested. She met with leaders like Eldridge Cleaver and Angela Davis. To her, it was simple. Injustice anywhere was unacceptable. But to the FBI, it was treasonous. At the time, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had launched an operation called COINTELPRO, an illegal counterintelligence program designed to surveil, sabotage, and destroy domestic political groups deemed dangerous. The Black Panthers were high on that list, and anyone associated with them became a target. Jean Seberg, the blonde American sweetheart now fraternizing with so-called radicals, was suddenly under the microscope. The FBI wiretapped her phones. They followed her movements. They infiltrated her circle of friends and even recorded intimate moments in her home. The surveillance wasn't just to gather information. It was to destroy her credibility. And their most vicious move was still to come. In 1970, Jean Seberg became pregnant. She was married to French author Romain Gary, but rumors began swirling that the baby's father was a member of the Black Panthers. The FBI planted a false story in gossip columns suggesting exactly that. The goal was simple: public shame, career collapse, and psychological devastation. It worked. Jean was hospitalized with severe depression. She gave birth prematurely, and her daughter died 2 days later. In an act of unthinkable grief, Jean held an open casket funeral for the baby to prove that she was white, not biracial. But the damage was irreversible. Studio offers stopped overnight. Producers saw her name as radioactive. She was quietly blacklisted, not by formal decree, but by fearful silence. Her political outspokenness, her support of the wrong causes, and her refusal to play Hollywood's game had made her unemployable. What had begun as an artistic rebellion had now become a personal crucifixion. Jean Seberg's stardom had reached its peak, but the spotlight no longer flattered. It exposed. She had risked everything for principle, and in return, the industry she once longed to conquer turned its back on her completely. She was banned, not by law, but by culture. Peak of career. Jean Seberg's peak wasn't defined by blockbusters or Academy Awards. It was defined by cultural defiance. At a time when most actresses were being polished into indistinguishable screen sirens, Jean became the face of cinematic rebellion. By the mid-1960s, she had reached an apex few American actresses ever would, idolized in Europe, politically influential, and artistically fearless. But her stardom wasn't measured in money or studio clout. It was measured in impact. In France, Jean was no longer just the American girl in Paris. She was cinema's new soul. Films like La Récréation and Les Hautes Solitudes showcased her stripped-down, emotionally raw performances that defied the glamorous expectations of a leading lady. Directors praised her honesty on screen. Unlike Hollywood, where actresses were suffocated by studio control, in France she was allowed to be complicated, sad, philosophical, fully human. It was this honesty that made Lilith such a critical high point. As a disturbed woman in a psychiatric facility, Jean gave a performance so haunting and layered that even her critics had to pause. The film wasn't a commercial success, but it earned Seberg newfound respect among serious film circles. Suddenly, the same actress once dismissed as a flat Joan of Arc was being invited to retrospectives and hailed as a feminist icon before the term even took root in pop culture. But Seberg's influence wasn't just cinematic. She became a fashion muse. Her cropped hair, bold eyeliner, and effortless Parisian style influenced an entire generation of women. Magazines no longer described her as the next big thing. She was the thing. For a brief period, Jean Seberg didn't belong to Hollywood or even France. She belonged to the future. Despite her growing prominence, Jean never tried to buy back her way into Hollywood's good graces. She didn't bend to publicists or studio bosses. Instead, she embraced risk. In Paint Your Wagon, opposite Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin, she played Elizabeth, a woman in a polyandrous relationship. While the musical itself drew mixed reviews, Jean's role challenged conventional morality and made American audiences uncomfortable. And she loved that. Still, the cracks beneath the surface began to widen. Her activism had put her on the FBI's radar, and by 1968, she was under relentless surveillance. The FBI had made her a person of interest, documenting every move, every call, every political donation. She was frequently tailed, harassed, and emotionally drained by the pressure. At the very height of her fame, when she was starring in both European and American films and hailed as a cultural icon, the smear campaign began. The rumor, planted by the FBI and picked up by gossip columns, was that her unborn child was fathered by a Black Panther member. This wasn't just an attack on her political stance. It was a brutal, racist assault on her personal life and womanhood. Jean's mental health crumbled. She delivered the baby prematurely, and the infant died soon after. In a chilling moment of desperation and defiance, Jean invited the press to view her child's body in an open casket to prove the lie false. This wasn't a scandal, it was a tragedy. In one calculated move, her career was quietly ended. No studios came to her defense. No director stood up for her. Jean Seberg had become too dangerous to hire, too emotional to trust, too political to protect. She wasn't officially banned, but every major American studio ceased contact. Roles dried up. Her name, once whispered with admiration in European cafes, was now absent from casting rooms. She was exiled by omission. Despite this, Jean continued working. She appeared in low-budget films in Europe, sometimes in languages she barely spoke, grasping for relevance, holding on to art. She took roles beneath her talents, not for fame, but to keep the spark alive. The Jean Seberg of the late 70s was a woman running from ghosts. Her daughter's death, the surveillance, the betrayal of an industry she once trusted. She had reached the summit of artistic freedom and had been punished for it. The downfall, redemption, and later years. By the early 1970s, Jean Seberg had become a phantom in her own life. Once adored for her cinematic cool, she now drifted through film sets in Europe, half wanted, half forgotten. The star who helped define the French New Wave was being slowly erased from American memory. But the wound wasn't professional, it was psychological. Jean was unraveling, and the scars left by the FBI's secret war on her were no longer hidden. She had survived the murder of her reputation and the death of her child, but the trauma never loosened its grip. Depression haunted her. Insomnia took over her nights. She struggled with relationships. Her marriage to Romain Gary collapsed under the weight of grief and paranoia. The world she once navigated with elegant rebellion had become a prison of anxiety, fear, and betrayal. Throughout the 70s, Jean tried to hold on. She took minor roles in European films like Airport and La Ligne de Demarcation, but they felt hollow. The sparkle that once radiated from her screen presence was now dimmed by pain and medication. Friends said she would smile one moment, then sink into a shadow the next. She trusted no one fully, and for good reason. She knew she was being watched. Eventually, the truth emerged. In 1979, under pressure from Congress and journalists, the FBI admitted to targeting Jean Seberg with a smear campaign. Internal documents proved that they had planted false stories, monitored her phone calls, and destroyed her public image, all without due process or remorse. But by the time that revelation reached the press, the damage had long been done. Jean was not alive to hear the apology. She died just weeks before the story broke. On August 30th, 1979, Jean Seberg went missing in Paris. Her body was found 11 days later in the back seat of her white Renault, parked along a quiet street, partially hidden by overgrowth. She was wrapped in a blanket, clutching a bottle of barbiturates. The cause of death was officially ruled as suicide, an overdose. A note beside her read only, "Forgive me. I can no longer live with my nerves." But even her death was shrouded in doubt. French police raised questions. She had taken so many pills. and yet her body appeared strangely undisturbed. Some speculated she had been drugged elsewhere. Others believed she may have been driven to her final location. There were bruises on her body. Some whispered of murder. Others called it a cover-up. But like much of Jean's life, the final truth was buried beneath layers of politics, pain, and paranoia. What is known as this? Jean Seberg, one of the most recognizable faces of a cinematic revolution, died at the age of 40. And not from irrelevance or bad reviews, but from systemic cruelty. Her political activism had made her a target. Her emotional openness had made her vulnerable. And her refusal to conform had made her expendable in the eyes of Hollywood. Redemption came posthumously. In the years after her death, film scholars, feminists, and political historians began to reclaim her legacy. Documentaries were made, books were written. Kristen Stewart portrayed her in the 2019 film Seberg, bringing renewed attention to her tragic story. Directors and critics who once ignored her now spoke of her as a pioneer, a woman who refused to play the game, even when it cost her everything. And as the files from COINTELPRO became public, Jean's story became more than a Hollywood cautionary tale. It became a symbol of what happens when power fears the truth, and when a woman dares to live outside the mold crafted for her. She wasn't just blacklisted, she was sacrificed on the altar of American fear. Today, Jean Seberg stands not only as an icon of film, but as a warning. Her downfall wasn't the result of poor talent or public scandal. It was engineered. Carefully, deliberately, and fatally. Hollywood didn't just lose a star, it lost a conscience. Jean Seberg wasn't banned for failure. She was silenced for fearlessness. Her story is a chilling reminder that truth-tellers in Hollywood often pay the highest price. But her light endures, not as a cautionary tale, but as a legacy of courage, complexity, and the cost of refusing to be controlled.